Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at the final day of the 2018 St. Louis Rapid and Blitz tournament. They played 9 games of Blitz today, 5 minutes on the clock, 3 seconds added for every move that they make. We're going to be looking at a game from round 15 of the Blitz portion, 24 round overall in the tournament. They did play 9 rounds of Rapid before the Blitz portion. Our competitors, White's going to be played by Maxime, MVL, as many people know him, and Black's going to be played by Fabiano Caruana, the American who will be facing Magnus Carlsen later this year for the World Championship. Both of these players coming into round 15 are in contention to win this thing. They're 3rd and 4th place respectively. Some of it will come down to how they fare against those players above them, which they do play later in the tournament. But this was an exciting game that I wanted to go over today. So MBL gets us started with pawn to e4. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez, which we see quite often, but instead the Berlin defense, which we almost see exclusively at knight to f6. Instead, we see pawn to a6, bishop to a4, and then knight to f6. So castle on the king side, bishop to e7, getting into the closed defense. A little bit different. Sometimes we'll see just the pawn come down to b5 right away, bishop to b3, and then black has a lot of different options from here, pawn to d6 being the main one. So a little bit interesting for us to see something different. The closed defense, not the most common at the highest level play. Bishop to e7, pawn to d3. More common for white to play rook to e1 or pawn to d4. Peter Fiedler actually did a video series on pawn to d3. It's not extremely common up until this point, but I feel like ever since that video series came out, we've seen more and more players play this. One of the highly respected players out there. So anytime he comes up with a new variation in the Ruy Lopez, a lot of players take notice. So after pawn to d3, then we get into what we expected to see earlier. Pawn to b5, kicking the bishop back here to b3. Pawn d6, solidifying the pawn chain, and then pawn to a3. Something Bobby Fischer used to do quite a bit. Bring the bishop here to b3. Push this pawn forward to a3. Has a little safe haven right here on a2 when your opponent has their pawns on e5 and d6. Does open up the door for the light square bishop to really control this long light square diagonal. The king is the only piece defending the square on f7, so it can just put a lot of pressure on your opponent. They always have to be thinking about, what is this bishop doing? Is my king in a safe spot? And in a blitz game, that can take its toll on his opponent. Fabiano castles on the king side, knight to c3 development from white. Pawn to h6, stopping the knight coming up here to g5 as well as the bishop coming to g5. Many times I think players are going to just snap play pawn to h3. It's the easiest. It's going to be doing the same thing, stopping the bishop coming down to g4 as well as the knight. But white has other plans, and he plays bishop to e3, just centralizing the bishop, rook to e8, centralizing as well, and then pawn to a4. And this is a spot where many times players make mistakes because they're just not sure what to do. Okay, all my pieces have developed. How do I continue? Pawn to h3 makes a lot of sense. You can't make too many mistakes playing something like this. But you could also just play rook to e1. Centralizing your rooks is always a good idea. Knight to d5, just starting to attack your opponent. You can always, think about where they can go and how they can attack. Black doesn't have a lot of strong attacks right here. If he wants to bring his own knight down here to d4, you have both the knight and the bishop attacking it. But in the game, we see pawn to a4. Fabiano pushes pawn b4, really forces the knight to now come up here to d5. So white may have thought that he would get that eventually, pushing the pawn further in the meantime. Knight comes to a5, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back a2. Knight takes, bishop comes up here. So white does lose a small little tempo because he did have to move the bishop back and then capture. But black also has the knight over here on a5. Does not want to hold the knight here on a5. It's not doing anything. I always want your knights in the center of the board. So it'll be interesting to see how Fabiano gets this back involved into the game, because right now, not helping at all. Pawn to c6, forcing the bishop back, bishop to a2, pawn to c5. So black's done a good job of pushing his pawns on the queen side of the board. Does have a backward pawn here on d6 that white can eventually start to attack. Not under any huge pressure right now, but you can see clearly that black is starting to push on the queen side of the board. That's where he sees his advantage. On the white side, looks at it and says, okay, my advantage is going to be on the king side. So he starts to maneuver his knight here to d2. Then after bishop to g5, pawn to f4. So you always want to be taking the initiative with the white pieces, especially in a blitz game. So starting to attack on the king side, since that is his best path forward, is definitely the way to go. So pawn to f4, pawn takes, bishop takes, then the bishop comes down here to e6. Could have exchanged, but decided not to, just develop his light square bishop. Bishop takes here, rook recaptures on e6. Bishop takes and the queen takes. Don't want to capture with your pawn right here. Don't want to just give yourself double pawns if you don't have to. Also weakens just the defense in front of the king. But now the queen comes up here to h5, pawn to f6, not the pawn chain that you want. And then just queen down here to g4, forcing the rook to move. You don't have a very active queen right now. It's blocked off. How do you get involved into the game? Not very easy. So definitely the right path to just go ahead and take with the queen here on g5. White continues with rook up here to f5, attacking the queen. Queen moves back to e7. Knight down to f1, rook to e5. Rook comes back to f2. Pawn d5, there is the pawn takes, and then the rook captures here on d5. This is a spot where I think black has an opportunity to not take right away. Yes, he's down a pawn in material, but he can start to push forward, get a better position, and then take that material. What I mean is queen to d6 allows him to take this material. The only way to protect this pawn is if you see pawn push forward to c4, which you can actually en passant and take with your pawn right here. This pawn would leave. It's a move a lot of people don't recognize, but you could do that. The other option would be knight to e3. We can all see why this is bad. The rook is just going to take that right here. So I think queen to d6 allows black to really maneuver all of the pieces in the center of the board and then eventually take the pawn only when black wants to. In the game, decides to go and take with the rook on d5. Queen to f3, attacking the rook. Rook to d8. And then knight up here to e3, attacking the rook. Rook over here to e5. So let's take a look at what that may look like if it was different. Maybe queen to d7 instead. Then we could see queen to f3, rook over here to e8, rook to d1. Since we could see not really doing too much if the knight gets involved into the game. But if the queen takes, okay, I think this is going to be completely fine for black. He's controlling the center of the board. This setup is better for black in my opinion. But in the game, decides to go ahead and take with his rook after the queen comes over here. They've doubled up on the d file. Probably want to be doubling up on the open e file. But that's where we are. Knight to e3, rook to e5, knight to f5, attacking the queen. And now Fabiano actually took the most time he has in the game so far, at about 50 seconds, but keep in mind he only has 5 minutes total, so when you're thinking that long, you're also thinking while your opponent's going, that's a long time. He's just not really sure in this position how to continue. His queen is under attack. He decides to go for rook to e1. We do see an exchange on the board. Queen comes down here to e1. Rook to f1, just stopping the attack, and then queen back to e5. NVL continues with pawn to c3. We do see an exchange there on c3. And then king to h7. Did have the option to just take here on c3. I think if he does this, it's going to end up in a draw. Neither player wants a draw. They have an opportunity to win or definitely get in the top 2 in this tournament. A draw, you only get half a point in the blitz portion, so you don't want to be drawing. And both sides have a pretty aggressive position. Not a lot of time on the clock. Either side can win this game. From here, knight to e7. Since white is down in material, he almost has to play this line. Queen to f7. And then after the queen takes here on d3, then there's just going to be a repetitive check, and there's going to end up being a draw from here. So black not looking to do that. Decides instead to go ahead and play king to h7. Pawn to d4. Pawn takes, and then queen up here to e6. Now white continues to be aggressive. He brings his queen over here to c3, attacking the knight here on a5, which Fabiano has done a poor job, although it's difficult. Where was the knight going to be going and when? But it's still just hanging out over here on a5. So white definitely has the upper hand as far as active pieces on the board. Rook down here to d5. Another option he had would be to play queen to b6. I like this better. It adds another attacker on the square here on d4, and it also defends this knight on a5, which he's going for. But decides to play rook down here to d5. Knight to e3, attacking the rook. Rook comes over here to g5, and then the pawn pushes forward to d5. And it's always tricky. You never know what your opponent is up to. We see black play queen to e5. He underestimated the pawn pushing forward. And maybe he thought that he would try to bring the rook over and start to push, but what he didn't see was queen to d3, check. King comes back here to g8, and then this pawn starts pushing forward. And this is just another thing that black has to deal with. He doesn't have a knight involved into the game. White has a pretty aggressive position right here. He has a pass pawn pushing it. And so now black has to spend a lot of time trying to defend this. Knight to c6. Pawn continues to push forward with d7. And now an even more questionable move, and that is queen to e7. If your opponent is right here on the 7th rank, you really need to stop that from pushing. Yes, he has the knight here on c6 that can take that, but you just don't even want to have to worry about exchanging your knight if your opponent can double up here, bring the rook over here to d1. Just play knight to d8. Just stop him from ever pushing is the way to go. He plays queen to e7, and now knight to f5, attacking the queen. Things get tricky. The knight is being defended both by the queen and the rook right here. How does black continue? He brings his queen to c5, check, king to h1. Sure, kind of a, yeah, what are you going to do now? Knight to d8, but you can see how different it is with knight, or white already has his knight here on f5. So much better position for white. And at the end of the day, black's just a few moves late getting that knight here to d8. Queen to e4, just preparing the queen coming to e8. Not much black can do here. Queen to b6, protecting the knight here on d8. So when the queen does come up here, he can't just take this knight. But that's not what is on white's mind. He's looking for the checkmate. Queen to e8, king to h7, and then knight to e7. And this is going to be checkmate in a couple moves. There's no way for black to stop this. And at the end of this move in particular, Fabiano decides to go ahead and resign. So congratulations to NVL for winning this game in Blitz round 15, 24th overall of 27. Needed to win out to get the first prize. He ended up going draw, win. Now, he ended up winning the last game against Nakamura. Unfortunately for NVL, Nakamura just crushed the entire day. And even with a loss, Nakamura was able to capture the overall title of the Blitz and Rapid section. So they put all the points together for an overall winner. Nakamura with 22.5 points is your winner. In second place with 21.5 points is MVL. So did set himself up for a second place finish, 1 point behind Nakamura. In third place, we do have Mamadirav, which we saw a few games, played extremely well. Fourth place, Fabiano. So although he did fall in this game, played an extremely strong tournament. He led through the rapid portion, was dominating that for the first few days. Ended up stumbling in the Blitz portion, not the finish he was looking for, but all this is really just preparation for him for the World Championship. Fifth place, we did have Lagrave with 18 points. Interesting is last place we had Vachier with 13.5 points, so 9 points off the leader. And he actually beat the leader in the first round of the Rapid. We did go over that game, Vichy versus Nakamura. So how things changed from that round one that we looked at till the final round of 27. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the coverage of the 18 St. Louis Rapid and Blitz tournaments. We'll have some more tournament coverage throughout the rest of the year, finalized by the World Championship in November. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys next time.